looking at the key Supreme Court decisions over the years, we have, starting out, Marbury versus Madison in 1803. There was a question of late in the John Adams administration, just before the power was going to be turned over to Thomas Jefferson. There was an attempt to appoint a bunch of new judges, and there was a firestorm over this because this guy, Adams, had just been not reelected, and Jefferson was. And how dare he try to make a big structural reform that will put a bunch of his type of Federalist judge in power. Marbury versus Madison is the court case that dealt with this. And in this court case, the principle of judicial review was first promulgated, was first established. And what judicial review is the process by which the United States Supreme Court has the right and the duty to look at laws passed by the Congress and signed by the President and decide, are they constitutional? And in this case, the last-minute appointments by Adams were ruled unconstitutional, even though the court was headed by a Federalist, John Marshall, because Marshall was more concerned about the constitutionality of decisions rather than political expediency, which is precisely what you want in a judge. You want a judge who's going to call it like he sees it, straight, without political bias. And Marshall, for the most part, is able to achieve this. And in doing so, he really carves out the role of the United States Supreme Court from here on in. The Supreme Court is the court of last resort, and it judges the actions, the laws passed by the legislative and the executive branches on the basis of their constitutionality. And by this point, people accept that the Supreme Court is going to have the final say on such things. That is judicial review. Now, McCulloch versus Maryland, 1819, deals with the supremacy of the federal government over the states' governments when those interests collide. And in terms of commerce between the states will not interfere with the federal power to regulate. There are implied powers that McCulloch versus Maryland asserts in the Constitution that are not specifically there. As a conservative, this one is like turning a trowel in my guts. I just don't like it. But what it clearly does is it establishes that if there is a conflict, a constitutional conflict, where the federal government and the states both have jurisdiction, which happens, that in the end, if the federal government wants to, it can assert a supremacy, and the Supreme Court has said that implied powers say that this is the federal government's ball to drop. Now, if the federal government overreaches, the courts will presumably get involved. Why does the court do this, you ask? Remember, the U.S. Constitution is replacing the old Articles of Confederation from the 1780s. And the Articles of Confederation's great problem was that they were so weak, they had so little power for the central government, that in effect what we would have had is a bunch of competing states like France, Germany, Britain, Spain, Italy, and Poland, all fighting it out over North America. Instead of being one republic, we would have been a bunch of independent countries fighting loosely confederated against outsiders. But the Constitution creates a stronger federal government, and the McCulloch versus Maryland reflects this. Then we go to Gibbons versus Ogden, 1824. And what Gibbons versus Ogden does, states cannot interfere with Congress regarding interstate commerce. That particularly is interstate commerce, whereas McCulloch versus Maryland is a more general assertion of federal supremacy and implied powers. So Gibbons versus Ogden. If you have interstate trade, if the Congress, the U.S. Congress, is trying to establish reasonable regulation of that, which, according to the Interstate Commerce Clause, they have the power to do, if states try to mess with things like that, the states are going to be smacked down because the federal government has supremacy in these cases, has jurisdiction over interstate trade, because no single state can control interstate trade well, because interstate, it should be obvious. Now we come to Worcester versus Georgia, 1832. Here's an interesting case on several levels. First off, the merits of the case are, on Native American or Indian reservations, who has the power to decide who can and cannot live there? Well, the decision of the court was that the tribe and only the tribe has that right to make that call. So there was a white missionary on a Georgia Cherokee Indian reservation who refused to leave. The tribal elders said, "You're not one of us. You don't have a right to be here on the reservation. Get out. We do not approve you staying here on a waiver." At which point, courts and legal decisions were made. And the result was that the court sided with the Cherokee and made a decision that said that the only people on Indian land are those that the Indians permit. This is famously the case, the 1832 case, where President Andrew Jackson says Chief Justice Marshall has made his decision. Now let's see him enforce it. In other words, the president is openly defying a U.S. Supreme Court decision, which is something that's almost unthinkable today. And hopefully it stays unthinkable, because that's what's called a constitutional crisis. But back in 1832, we were a one-party state, the Democratic Republicans. Andrew Jackson, again, is the closest thing this country has ever had to a dictator, and he got away with it. Hopefully it wouldn't happen today. Hopefully neither the Congress nor the president is going to be brazen enough, stupid enough, or reckless enough to try to say no to a U.S. Supreme Court decision. Whereas what they should do, if they don't like it, is win another election, get more people in office, write a new law, and let the Supreme Court challenge that if they want to. That's the way you're supposed to handle it. Incrementalism, compromise, time, all put there by our founders to slow change down and prevent anyone from getting too much power in the middle of a single crisis. Okay. The Charles River Bridge versus the Warren Bridge, 1837. Okay. Charles River Bridge Company is given a commission by the city of Boston to build a bridge over the Charles River to Cambridge, where Harvard is. And they start building it, but they're taking their time. Well, they're also going to charge tolls to pay for the bridge. Meanwhile, another bridge company comes along called the Warren Bridge, and they are going to build another bridge over the Charles River from Boston roughly to Cambridge, and they're not going to charge tolls. And suddenly the Charles River Bridge people are like, whoa, no. We can't have this. So they go to court. Finally, it ends up in the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court says, first of all, the Charles River Bridge Company was never promised a monopoly, the only route from Boston to Cambridge. Number two, and this is important if you want to think about the limited powers of government, the court says that government has the right and duty to try to improve the conditions of society. Building a bridge between a major city and the mainland is going to bring lots of economic benefit, lots of interpersonal contact. It's going to be good, and therefore the government can actually manipulate private industry to an extent in order to bring about a good public result, good in the eyes of the government and the court, but it does expand the power of government. Now we come to probably the most infamous decision in the history of the United States Supreme Court. That is Dred Scott versus Sanford, 1857. By this point, the pressure building up over the Civil War, over the question of slavery, is really boiling. It is about to boil over and explode. Dred Scott's a slave. He is in a slave state with his master's family, and then his master moves to a free state. And they live there for a few years, and Scott continues to serve them, and then the master returns to a slave state. Scott refuses to go with him. Says, I'm here in a free state. You brought a slave to a free state. It's a free state for a reason. I'm not going anywhere. And this case ends up getting brought to the United States Supreme Court. Now, remember how divided the country is. Every time there's a new state added, since the 1820 Maine-Missouri Compromise, states have been added in pairs. Maine and Missouri added simultaneously. Maine's a free state, Missouri's a slave state. The balance is preserved. And this is true again and again and again as the United States expands westward. One free state, one slave state. That's how bad it is. We don't admit states without taking into account the slavery issue. The Supreme Court of the United States, trying to balance these two irreconcilable positions, ultimately says once a slave, always a slave. Just by moving to a free state, Dred Scott's owner does not lose title over Dred Scott and the other slaves. That, in effect, gets rid of the whole concept of free states. Because if slave owners can come to New York or Massachusetts or Maine or Connecticut or anywhere in the free state region and bring a whole bunch of slaves and start growing a whole bunch of tobacco and undercutting the free farmers around them, nothing anyone can do. But more than that, the Supreme Court of the United States once again has legitimized the institution of chattel slavery in the United States, which is a betrayal of our core ideals. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Property. But we don't practice that while we have slavery. So, Dred Scott versus Sanford, 1857. And then the Civil War happens. And we will continue after the Civil War next time.